Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Employee to Boss podcast. I am your host, Hayleigh Hayhurst, the owner of Espresso Podcast Production. Espresso Podcast Production is a full-service podcasting agency specializing in editing, marketing, and strategy. So if you're interested in starting a podcast, now is the time to connect with us because we are taking on new clients to help launch your podcast. So in this episode, I wanted to go through my favorite podcasting tools for beginners and more advanced podcasters. I have been in the podcast industry for, I want to say 7+ years, but I have been full-time in my business for about 3.5 years. That is when I started Espresso Podcast Production, and that's when I moved up to Seattle. Everyone always asks me, where did the espresso come from in podcast production? It's because I was new to Seattle. I was just starting a business, and the coffee culture here is crazy. I love coffee, and so I thought I would just combine my favorite things, podcasting, coffee, and play on the word espresso because espresso, fast. I'm fast at editing. I can do quick turnarounds for my clients and always do a great job with it. So I just thought that was why I should name my business Espresso Podcast Production. When I was starting off my podcast in college 7 years ago with my friend, that's where I learned editing. That's where I learned marketing and building a community of, to listen to my podcast. I started my podcast with my friend back in, I want to say, 2016. And so things have definitely changed over the last 7 years. But what I learned then is definitely things that I still use to this day with my clients. Of course, I've gotten better at everything I do. Things I have done have obviously changed. My strategy, how I approach podcasting, those have all changed, but a lot of things are the same. So that's where my credibility comes from, but I'm excited to talk to you about some incredible podcasting tools to use that I think will make it easier for you to start your podcast, and it'll just feel a lot more achievable. I know that the tech side of things is always very intimidating. That's the feedback I get when my clients come to me to chat about their podcast, about the podcast that they want. The tech always confuses them. So that is why I have my podcast launch program where basically all you have to do is record and then send it to me and I get everything nice and polished and published for you so you have a professional podcast at the end. But if you are doing this on your own, this episode is definitely going to help you. So to dive right in, let's talk about recording your podcast, okay? So there's a couple different ways that you can record your podcast, and it all depends on the level that you want to be on, as well as if you're doing interviews or not doing interviews. So if you are doing a solo podcast, you're not having any guests, a great place to record your podcast is just on your computer. You could do something like GarageBand if you have Apple products, and you can record directly into there. You could also just record into like a memo on your phone. There's a lot of different options for these, but I really encourage you to have a video podcast if you're just starting out. So what I recommend is starting off with Zoom. Now, you're probably going to hear a lot of negative things about recording with Zoom because it does compress the audio and it's not as crisp as it may sound when you're just talking. But if you're just starting out, Zoom is going to be very easy for you to just start with. And I think that's the most important thing. Don't make it too complicated on yourself. You probably already have Zoom. It's a low cost. It's free if it's under 40 minutes of recording. So there's a lot of options with it. And you can also have guests on Zoom. You can record the audio right in there. You can record the video and just edit it super easily. So that is going to be my recommendation for recording your podcast. Now, if you are a little bit more advanced or you want some better quality, which I'm all for. I love good audio quality. You're definitely going to want to look at a program called Riverside. Riverside is made for podcasting. It's a lot like Zoom, but you can only use it in Google Chrome. I use this for some of my clients, and I always have good results with it. So that one is better for the audio quality, but if you're starting out, definitely just stick with Zoom. Another option, and this ties into the editing part, is a program called Descript. Descript is what I use when my clients have a video podcast. For the most part, it depends if they're recording with multiple cameras or not. But if you're just, having a single shot, or you're just having yourself and a guest, Descript is going to be super easy. It's great. It's very beginner friendly. And the best part about it is it transcribes your entire podcast for you. And so when you're editing, it's really like you're just editing a transcript. Descript has come a long way since I started using it a couple years ago, but they just released a bunch of new features that I am loving. And so that's actually where I'm recording this podcast today. So that goes back to what to do to record your podcast. You can record directly into Descript. It transcribes it, makes it very easy. I will say, when you're creating like your intro and outro and music and all of that, Descript does have its limitations. And so that is where I use more professional software such as Adobe Audition or Premiere Pro. Those are typically my favorite ones for editing because I can be a lot more like particular with it. And so that's just because I am a podcast producer and have been in this industry for a long time. And so that's why I use, higher quality products and programs. But if you're just starting out, definitely don't put yourself through too much stress and, just start with what you can. The next question I get a lot is which hosting platform to use. So I'm not going to go too deeply into this, but when you're starting a podcast, you record it, edit it, do all the things, and then you need to submit it to a RSS feed to go out to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Play, all the other podcast platforms. And so for this, I personally use Spreaker. A lot of them are very, very similar. It only gets different when you're looking to maybe have some sponsors or when you're looking to have some dynamic ads in your podcast. But that's not beginner friendly, so that is not going to be included in this episode. I just recommend Spreaker is my number one. I love the platform. It's through iHeartRadio. Another question I get a lot is, how do I create a logo? Where do I find music? How do I create graphics? So for logos, there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can hire a graphic designer. You can go into a program called Canva, which is great for just some graphics. And for music, there's a bunch of other platforms out there. Storyblocks is one that I recommend a lot. So Canva and Storyblocks if you are just doing it, all on your own. Personally, I created my own logo and I've changed it once since my launch date, and I'll probably change it again going forward. But for my music, I did have a person create it especially for me. So his name is down in my show notes. It always is. It's in every episode, and he's great. And there's a bunch of other artists who will create podcast music. If you're looking for someone to create your podcast music, send me a message on Instagram. It's at Espresso Podcast Production, and I will connect you with a few people that I know who create music, and they're all great. Now, I also really recommend a program called Headliner.fm. Headliner is great for creating audiograms and just super user-friendly. Canva can do similar things, but I think Headliner is particularly for audiograms, so I really recommend it. And my last program that I use a lot is actually to schedule my podcast interviews and meetings, and anyone who wants to connect with me, I schedule a 30-minute call with them for free, and this program is called Calendly, and I highly recommend it. I think the days of us, messaging back and forth and being like, oh, does this day work with you? Does this day work with you? And then, manually doing it are over. So Calendly is a virtual meeting scheduler that I really recommend. I do have some affiliate links for these programs. I use them, so it's not like I'm making money and that's why I'm talking about them. I've been using them for a long time and reached out and was like, hey, do you have an affiliate program? And the ones that do, I will put in the show notes. So specifically Descript, I have an affiliate link for that. So if you're interested in Descript, definitely click the link in my show notes. Now, I wanted to add a second part to this episode because for those of you who are like, whoa, this is too much. This is so many programs. I don't want to do all this. I wanted to talk to you about like things to look for in a podcast editor or a producer. So when you're looking to hire someone to run your podcast for you, maybe it's editing, maybe it's something more like what I do, which is I do offer just editing. I offer video and audio editing, but I also have strategy calls. I have a coaching program, and I have done for you services where I can help you grow your podcast. And so there's a lot of things that I offer. So depending on what you're looking for, connect with me, and I'm sure if I can't do it, I'll find you someone that will. But in the podcast industry, I'm very confident that I can be able to help you with your podcast. So I wanted to talk about things to look for in a podcast editor or producer. Now, these are just two main things that I wanted to share, and then two nice to have things. So number one, and this is something that I've changed my mind on in the past, but make sure that your podcast editor or producer has their own podcast. I think that this is important because they will be able to help you with the setup. They'll be able to help you with knowing like how to record, giving you some tips. Any client I have, whether they're like a coaching client, a strategy client, or someone that I just edit for, I always give them tips on, best practices for recording, this and that. And so I do think there is a strong benefit in hiring a podcast editor or producer who has their own podcast. That means they're consistent with their podcast. And the reason I started my podcast initially, and to go back, I didn't have a podcast when I first started my business, but I had one in the past, so that's where I learned how to do everything. And so just wanted to be like fully transparent with that. I probably had my business for a year before I started my podcast. So I think having my own podcast really does make it so when potential clients come to me, they can listen to my audio editing style. They can listen to myself. They can get to know me. They can feel connected. All of these things that's initially why I started my podcast. It wasn't to blow it up and get all these listeners. It wasn't to, get sponsorships. The reason I started my podcast was for potential clients to be able to hear me and understand my editing style, but also entrepreneurship can be a very lonely place, but also can be a very community-driven place. So I wanted the latter. And so on my podcast, I do interview a lot of amazing women entrepreneurs who are just killing it. And it makes me feel so inspired and excited and just growing my community. It is the most fun. So that's number one, make sure they have a podcast of their own. Number two is make sure that they use professional software because again, I just, signed a client who she is across America and has a lot of questions about how to actually set it up. I think in the past, during COVID, a lot of us were recording just on our computers, but for those of us who want to record in person with guests, or really have that amazing video, that's really where the shift is coming in the podcast industry. Video is definitely being talked about more, and it's more important now than ever to have a video podcast. And so the reason I was able to help her set up her studio, even though I'm in Seattle and she's in Florida, is because I've done this before and I have worked with other clients to set up their podcast studios. So make sure that whoever you're working with uses professional editing software, recording software, and also maybe has their own setup so they can help you when you run into questions. Of course, you can always, do a Google search, but there is so much that'll show up, and so many people, especially who are, maybe want to make podcasting feel scarier than it is, who are putting up roadblocks for you and maybe describing it in a challenging way that shouldn't be so challenging. That does happen a lot, so just watch out for that. But Googling what you want answers to can be intimidating. So that's why I really recommend finding someone who's done it and is professional at it. Now, I wanted to add 2 nice to have points. Number 1 is make sure they're interested in your topic. Okay. I actually was interviewed on someone's podcast and they were asking me like tips for guests. Like if you want to be a podcast guest, like how can you do that? And so I was telling them that like I love working with my clients because like I learn so much from their podcasts. I'm interested in all the topics. And I know this is true for myself and a lot of other podcast editors. When we work with a client who we're interested in the topic, for me specifically, I'm a lot more engaged. Now, even if I'm not interested in the topic or like whatever it is, I'm not going to not be engaged. That's not what I'm saying. But if I am learning about a topic or I'm super excited about what my client's talking about, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. It also will help if your podcast editor or producer is interested in your topic. They will be able to give you better show notes. They'll be able to give you better social media graphics. They'll be able to pull better quotes. All of these things, like I'm saying, I can do this even if I'm not super interested in the topic. But if I am interested in the topic, like I am with all my clients' podcasts, it is a plus for me and for them because I'm like, oh my gosh, that's perfect. This is like the quote of the episode. This just blew me away. So I'm always very engaged when I'm editing. It just is so much more interesting, and I feel like I put so much more energy, like better energy into it when it's a topic that I love. And to go along with this, point 4, make sure you vibe with whoever your podcast editor or producer is. This person is directly impacting your work. They are touching all of the audio. They are creating graphics. Their energy is important, especially when, you want a specific vibe for your podcast. If you like the person that you're editing and they have a, connection with you, I think that it just like makes it so much better. This is why when I work with my clients, I work with them all long term. I have not had a short-term client. They always work with me for months and years, and my longest client, we're going on 3 years together, which just like melts my heart. I love her so much. And so I think this makes it a lot easier for you to communicate with the editor and for the editor to be able to communicate with you. Whenever I work with my clients for long terms, I find that like I understand what they're saying more, and I know their little quirks and what they're talking about. And so if they say, or like, or whatever it is, I know that. I know if they like that in there or not, and I can just remove it or keep it and really like match what they want the result to be without getting so much feedback from them. So those are my tips. That includes my favorite podcasting tools as well as what to look for in a podcast editor or producer. If you have any questions about this episode, you can connect with me at hello@espressopodcastproduction.com or come to my website, Espresso Podcast Production, and you can contact me through there. I also am mainly hanging out on Instagram these days, so you can come find me the same name, Espresso Podcast Production. And if you have any questions or want to work together or just have want to connect, come find me. And I love connecting with new people, and I love growing the podcasting community. I think it is so much fun, and I absolutely love doing what I do. Check the links in the show notes for all of those platforms that I recommended, and I cannot wait to talk to you next time. Thank you for listening to the Employee to Boss podcast. If you made it to the end of this episode, I hope that you implement the actionable steps from this week's experts so you can get started with your business today. Please rate, review, and subscribe to the Employee to Boss podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. It helps more than you could ever imagine. Remember, a little progress each day leads to big results. We come out with a new episode every Tuesday. To access our show notes, transcripts, and courses, please check out espressopodcastproduction.com.